Okay, let's get started. It's our pleasure to have Hyeran Jo with us today. As you know, the format here of the colloquium, because we only have 5 minutes for the speaker, is that we don't give flowery introductions. But Hyeran is extremely well published associate professor at Texas A&M. She got her PhD at University of Michigan. And most of her work has centered around the area of international conflict and conflict resolution. So, please.
Thank you. I'm extremely pleased to be here. I met Lynn 15 years ago as a grad student, so I'm really honored to be here to give a talk at this prestigious workshop. The title of my talk will be Weapon of the Week, Rebel Groups and their International Law Talk. And the time frame is going to be 1974 to 2011. So it'll be contemporary rebel groups and civil conflicts that I'll be talking about. So the title is coming from James Scott's work. He's done extensive work on political strategies of the week, and that's the question I'm working on in this paper. What are the political strategies of the week? And the week here is rebel groups and civil wars. They are substantially weaker than national governments with a lot of arms and national army. They usually fight with just knives, sometimes without uniforms. And I purposely have a question mark at the end to give a little twist to the results. So I'm going to argue that rebel groups talk international law as a weapon. It's not going to be weapon. It's not going to be arms, but it's going to be verbal weapon for them to use against the national governments. And they are the weak, but among the rebel groups that are weak, strong groups are the ones that get to talk about international law. So that's my primary argument, and I'm going to show you some evidence from the text analysis from rebel group documents and some regression analysis to track down the reasons why some armed groups engage in this kind of international law while others don't. And this is one word cloud that you didn't find in the paper, but I had a lot of fun constructing these kinds of word clouds. And word clouds are sometimes out of context, so they don't really give you what the rebel group said, but you can kind of get the idea how the thinking within rebel groups progressed over the years. So in 1981, you see a lot of political demand-related words like people, military, will, revolutionary. Now, fast forward to 2014, you see a lot of words related to human rights and humanitarian words. So you see some trends in the text data. So to illustrate my argument, I'm going to give you a recent example of 2 rebel groups in Myanmar, and you probably heard a lot about the sad fate of Rohingya population, Muslim population in the heavily Buddhist society in Myanmar. And this is Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army Rohingya militants. And believe it or not, it is a state with more than dozens of rebel groups. There are Chins, there are Shans, and there are Mons, and one of the strongest group is Karen National Army, Karen National Union. Is the political wing of the Karen National Army. And Karens are very adroit in their diplomatic efforts. So they issued a lot of rebel-related documents. They have internal code of conduct. They negotiated a contract with the UN. They issued various documents related to the commitment not to use anti-personnel mines. So according to my theoretical expectation about strong rebel groups, we would expect to see a lot of international law talk by Karen National Army. But if you talk about weak groups, like Rohingya groups, we don't really find rebel group related international law talk. And you will see that National Army, Tatmadaw, is equipped with heavy armory compared to Karen National Army. And I wanted to show you a little clip from CNN. What they look like, the Rohingya extremists.
Machetes and what they claim are a few stolen rifles. Images filmed and distributed by a new rebel group that claims responsibility for ambushing and killing government forces like...
You can see them like just with sticks, and they are in shorts and sometimes flip-flops. And they are fighting with that kind of strength. Whereas if you see Karen National Army, they at least have uniforms, and they have a command structure within them. So this is the picture of comparison of armed strength, National Army, and a strong, organized rebel group, and very weak rebel group. And again, according to my expectation, we would expect a lot of diplomatic activities related to international law from Karen National Army. So this is another example from home. My husband just sent this video yesterday, and I think it's very illustrative. She's my 2-year-old girl. She is demanding for a lollipop here. And she's playing strategy of the week. She knows that her daddy has a lot of bag of lollipops, and she learned the politics of the week. I mean, making statements. So she's well, so she's the weaker one. But she knows these kinds of strategies, and she is braver than her brother. And her brother doesn't usually do this kind of strategy. So, again, I mean, that kind of illustrated my argument that among the weak, so among my kids, strong ones that know what's going on, I mean, they usually make the demands, public demands or public statements about their desires. So I was going to say where I was. So I did a lot of research on rebel groups, and I wrote a book about why rebel groups might care about international law in their behavior. And while I was doing that research, I thought a lot about how rebel groups think, and I was following some of the Twitters and Facebooks of rebel group leadership, spokesmen of M23, for example, followed a lot of tweets from Human Rights Council, from UN, and a lot of prominent political leaders. And I wanted to know and have systematic evidence of what they think. So that's why I conducted this research about text data and try to trace the reason for their behavior. And I have companion papers trying to look at their legal understanding about international humanitarian law. And I have also a paper with international lawyers in Europe about whether groups' participation in lawmaking, international lawmaking, would be normatively a good idea or not, because it has implications for global governance in security areas. And I just published in the Yearbook of International Humanitarian Law about how to improve the compliance with rebel groups, compliance with international law by rebel groups, because it has implications. And many of the rebel groups use child soldiers still. Many of them kill civilians. And there is normative policy aspect that we talk about, how to really bring down the level of violence among rebel groups. So where I'm going with this project is more policy-oriented work. So we have a lot of work that point out the difficulty of doing military interventions. So people doubt the wisdom of state building in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. And I wondered under what conditions soft approaches might work. So if these kinds of hard approaches like military intervention wouldn't work, what kind of soft intervention approaches like persuasion dialogue or community engagement or technical assistance, under what conditions would these policy approaches work out? And this is my 5 or 7 year project down the road, trying to think about field experiments that could be done in collaboration with international humanitarian organizations in conflict zones around the world.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So I'll be taking the cue. Mustafa?
Okay, I think so. The word cloud that you showed, I think, is quite informative. So you see that in the past, the rebel groups mostly talked about people. More recently, they talk about human rights, for example. So is that an indication that more recently the rebel groups rely on foreign governments, or there is more foreign intervention? And maybe the reason that the bigger rebel groups are more interested in, or they express more interest in human rights, is because the bigger ones are the ones that are sponsored by foreigners, because they have had the money to grow, basically, and that's why they are more interested in human rights, because that's how foreigners can actually pressure the domestic government. Yeah, and so the other question that I had was about whether these commitments to international agreements, are they unilateral, or do they engage in some sort of bilateral negotiations? Because if the second is true, then obviously any rebel group would want to do that, because that gives them some credibility, right? And also, these things are not enforceable, so you can make a public announcement without even following it. So in terms of compliance with these agreements, I was wondering how they do.
Thank you. So I have to do the stats. So I have the data about ISLAT support for rebel groups, but it's not really new phenomena. During the Cold War, like Cuba, Libya, I mean, they supported their guys, while democratic countries supported their guys. So it's not new phenomena, but I think what's new is rebel group strategies to really reach out and try to gain funds from them. Free Syrian Army, for example, they really reached out even to Congress members in the U.S. To really get the support from the U.S. Of course, a lot of Islamic groups don't do that, and they look out for Islamic charities, they look out for other kinds of routes, like smuggling, for example, or or trying to target oil fields, for example. So they have different kinds of revenues, but outside support is important part of the story, and I have to do the stats to figure out whether it's wax and wane or whether there's kind of mean there. And in terms of commitment, there are both. Some of them are unilateral and others are bilateral. And bilateral ones are increasing, actually. And I think it's primarily due to the international political environment. So, for example, ANC from South Africa, so they have a lot of trouble now because of corruption in South Africa, but when Nelson Mandela was there, they expressed commitment to Geneva Convention, for example, and then they filed those unilateral declarations within the International Committee of the Red Cross. So their diplomatic activity was that, and in comparison to that kind of unilateral activity, nowadays international actors are seeking these rebel groups. So you have a lot of humanitarian NGOs, you have a lot of sub-bodies within UN, like refugee office and UN office on children armed conflict. So they have, so of course, like UNDP and a lot of traditional ones that try to engage these non-state armed actors on the ground. So you see a lot of growing bilateral agreements over the years. And I think your question that gets at the theoretical angle that any rebel group might want to do that, but there are a lot of political obstacles on the way. So for example, Indian government, nowadays it's different, but in the 80s or 90s, they didn't really allow some of the international organizations to work, for example, in eastern part of the Indian territory, because there was a lot of secessionist movement, and Indian government also didn't want international actors to be involved in the Maoist area. So there is that political obstacle from the national government that are kind of weary about whether international actors should really interact with non-state armed actors, their opponents, their primary opponents in the territory, because they weren't sure about what kind of political benefits these armed groups might have, and whether they would gain any military benefit from that kind of international engagement. But certainly, I think bilateral agreement is increasing as opposed to unilateral declarations. And it gets at the core puzzle, theoretical puzzle, because it causes variation as to why some rebel groups engage in this kind of activity, diplomatic activity, while others don't.
Hi, Hyeran. And very hard work. Congratulations on this. And I have several questions, and maybe because probably I am biased, experienced in my own country, civil conflict over there.
Okay.
So, and I wonder whether there are some endogeneity issues here.
Oh, okay.
One of the things that you include over there is near these talks. I wonder whether this is an endogeneity issue here.
Mm-hmm.
When the peace talks process is going to take place, probably it is more likely that actually they might be the opposite. It could be a different way that you are portraying here. Also, to take into account other domestic factors. What is the source of funding for these rebel groups? Because the strength is not just about military strength, but also what is the source of funding. They might want just to say, look, we are complying with this international law, but indirectly they continue doing their own business. And another factor that I would like to for to see is about public opinion. When does public opinion already pushes them to start doing something in order to demonstrate, okay, we are ready to do something. So I wonder whether more domestic factors should be taken into account here in order to account for that. And also the age of the group to be interacted with some of these variables, because probably after a certain time, in our case, after 60 years, people were tired and ready of this, groups too, and they decided to do this. And actually, you have a very good citation about the Colombian case, and I wonder whether we should include also a variable related to religion, the influence of religion in this case, because especially in Latin America, we see how the Catholic Church has influenced these groups to actually sign up these agreements. Indeed, recently the Pope went to Colombia, and one group that was not ready to sign, we start talking about negotiation process, because of this visit, decided to start the negotiation process. Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether religion should also be taken into account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll probably go backwards. So religion. So my and your observation is right that that Catholic Church was heavily involved in this process. So ELN, for example, issued various documents, and some of the initiatives were coming from the Catholic Church, but not for FARC. I didn't see any involvement of Catholic Church in that group. So I think there is variation in there. And I didn't try religion variable, and I have religion variable from my book project, so I could test that idea. But my guess is that Islamic groups, you probably see the negative relationship between Islamists and the level of commitment that they have with respect to international law. There are some moderate Islamic groups like MILF from the Philippines that say that they would abide by some of the principles written in international humanitarian law, but a lot of extremist groups are out of this business, international law talk business. So that would be my guess. And public opinion, and interestingly, public doesn't really seem to figure large in this picture, maybe because it's international law documents. So my analysis shows that these kind of documents are primarily targeting government, national government as audience and international audience, and probably some of the public might be illiterate and they might not really read these documents. Some of the documents are directly to the public. So FARC, for example, issued this statement. So we are fighting this armed struggle. Governments have done these bad things, but we are the good guys. We plan to attack this area. Civilians don't go here because we don't want to kill innocent civilians. So some of the documents are directed to the public, but those are very rare. A lot of documents are directed toward government, just disparaging government's activities and just putting themselves on the high pedestal. And I think public opinion might have a role, and I have to investigate that. But according to the current analysis, they don't seem to figure it that large. And I suspect this might be because of the characteristic of dependent variable that is related to international law, not necessarily having a lot of trickle-down impact on the civilians. But I think public opinion among the rebel ranks would be very important. And I'll think about ways to get at that problem. And source of funding, it is very important. In my other paper, I found some of the groups that rely on private funding, like donors or diasporas, they might behave or might be more affected by external pressures like sanctions than other groups that rely on external sponsors or terrorist networks, so or smuggling or drugs. I think source of funding is kind of mentioned here and there in the paper, and I'll probably highlight the impact more in the next iteration. And the endogeneity of peace agreement. Rebel groups, the core argument here is that rebel groups, as they enter into peace agreements, they have certainly incentive to be strong, but then they have a lot of interest in showing that they are a viable political entity in the future. So when they negotiate these peace agreements, including FARC, they entered these provisions related to human rights or international humanitarian law. So that's the pattern I found in these data set. Thank you.
Sue, why don't I pair up some, because we always run out of,
Sure.
people end up wanting to get in the queue more. So, Federica, Dean,
Okay.
you have
Thank
a question?
Yeah, I do. I have a question and a comment. I enjoyed the paper very much. I just wanted, the comment is, and this actually came up in the presentation that you gave, focusing on the case on Myanmar. And I wonder to what extent the history of the conflict is adding a dimension, and to what extent that might be approached perhaps with a more sort of like a case study approach, as opposed to sort of like the econometrics or even the word count. Actually, I found the word count, the change over time, remarkable. But you mentioned the sort of like you mentioned the Korean organization, and so happening to know a little bit about the history of the conflict and the extent to which the Korean group was originally completely removed from the original Pangalong conference, and then ended up being the first group to sign the ceasefire agreement, and now being a fundamental player in the constitutional amendment process. I wondered to what extent the sort of like a long-term history of the conflict in the context of the rebel group's relationship with the state is supporting or affecting the decision to take up international law talk or not. And that was just sort of like an idea that came up in the based on this example. The question that I wanted to ask has more to do with the problem of commitment and the sort of like theoretical underpinning of the paper. Because it seems to me that if this is talk, if this is international law talk, what I kept on thinking as I was reading the paper is that, well, I talk and whatever, right? What are the implications of my talking? What are the implications of me writing, a 20-page document about my willingness to not use children like as soldiers, when then I don't really have an enforcement structure that determines upholding these agreements. And the null hypothesis in some way is that this is not, you need to show that this is not the case. And so on page 11, and this is what I guess I want to hear more about, is that you seem to believe that you say, by this logic, every rebel group should commit to a costless policy, and we would expect every group, not some group, to produce these documents, right? But that is predicated on the idea that talking international law is beneficial no matter what. And I wonder, if that is true, right? I would like to see a little bit more about how you think about this international law talking having a necessarily positive outcome for the viability, as you say, of the rebel group. It seems to me that in some cases, viability might depend on things that are completely different than international law, particularly human rights international law.
So I'll go backwards again. So about implications. So words are not these.
Right.
In the continuing research, I find that there's variation across issue areas as to the levels of whether rebel groups really follow through their words in their behavior. And this is where governance issue comes in. So in the issue of anti-personnel mines, this NGO, Swiss NGO, Geneva Call, provided a lot of technical assistance to demine the area. So rebel groups don't really have technology to detect where the mines are. They don't have demining capacity. So in those examples, what they call deed of commitment, that's international law document published by rebel groups, led to real actions and real outcomes. But if you are talking about civilian killing, there was no correlation. Rebel groups that said they would respect civilian life, they didn't do that. And if you are talking about child soldier issue, I'm still doing a lot of case studies, but in some cases where close monitoring is followed and where the norm is internalized via internal code of conduct, then we might have some hope where rebel groups say, okay, we'll get some assistance about reintegration programs for children, former child soldiers, and then they reduce the number of child soldiers over time. So I think there are some cases where institutional design might help them going from words to deeds. But in some of the difficult issues like civilian killing, I didn't find any correlation there. And international law talk is not all beneficial. I mean, some of the commitments are substantial. I mean, if you want to reduce the number of child soldiers, that's kind of eliminating your weapons. And if you can't really use child soldiers for fetching water or carrying flag or whatever, you are sacrificing your manpower in a way. So that's not really like costless commitment. And in some cases where rebel groups say they are not going to use anti-personnel mines, again, anti-personnel mines that have been in their military toolkit, and they have used anti-personnel mines against guarding off government soldiers. So committing to the idea that they will not use anti-personnel mines, I mean, that's not really costless commitment. So there is variation, of course, but international law commitment. And if I gave you the idea that that was the assumption I had, then I might have written it wrong. So I should probably go back to page 11 and correct for that. And in terms of history of conflict, and this idea about Myanmar groups, it just came to me. The CNN video, it's only a week old. So I'll try to incorporate some of the historical aspects to the paper more, maybe probably in the appendix, more detailed case study of some of the groups in Myanmar and some of the countries that have multiple rebel groups, because I'll have more comparison there in those cases. And in the paper, in the current version, the crude measure is rebel group age. So as they aged, the average year for rebel groups, these rebel groups, contemporary rebel groups, is about 6-7 years. And some of the groups, like Hyeran's, they live longer, like almost 30 years, 20, 30 years. And they have variable relationships with the government. And most of the groups that reach peace agreements, they become moderate over time. and they are the ones they engage in this kind of diplomatic activity vis-a-vis international actors as well.
But I would imagine, just a quick follow-up,
Yeah.
that Myanmar will give you an incredible case study because the conflict has been going on for so long.
Oh, okay.
And some of these groups, you can really see the variation between like places like Chin State and Brunei State, where you've got the civil war that has been going on for pretty much the same amount of time, but the variation in terms of like how the rebel groups interact with the state has changed dramatically.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this idea just came up a week ago, so I should work on that more. Thank you.
Okay, let's bundle up two people. So
Oh, you
Dean,
want to
Nabila,
get the
why don't we
questions and
take
then-
two questions and then you
Sure.
reply, and then we'll go to Sion and Phil.
Okay, well, my question is actually from Gustavo, and you touched on it a little bit, but I'll just read his
From
question.
Argentina.
Yeah, Gustavo Torres, who's watching. His question is following: expressing commitment is not the same as committing to a course of action. Expressing commitment could just be cheap talk. There's no cost to reneging. Do you have any evidence that the behavior of a rebel group is different after expressing a commitment to international law? I guess you talked a little bit about that and suggest maybe not so much.
Not so much.
Which begs the follow-up, then what is the lesson you're learning from this empirical exercise? So it's Gustavo.
Following up on Federica.
Well, I just mentioned there is variation. So in some cases, there might be hope for this type of engagement. And it'll depend on how national governments allow this international involvement to take place. It will depend on rebel group characteristics, whether they are agreeing to this kind of international involvement. And some of the rebel groups are not really agreeable to this kind of idea. So if you take into account all these political obstacles from the national government and rebel groups themselves, then for those groups who don't really experience this kind of obstacles, then there might be some hope for international engagement and the hope that this kind of engagement might lead to positive outcomes. And I mentioned some of the cases about child soldiering where UN closely monitors and the contractual terms that they negotiate over the years, and those cases might work out. And again, I mean, it all depends on the situation on the ground, conflict situation, and rebel group characteristics, and the decision by national governments. Oh, sorry,
No, but I mean, I guess the fundamental question that people are asking is, what makes any of these commitments credible?
Yeah.
And you're saying sometimes not. So
Right.
We want to know what is the sometimes and sometimes not, which is a follow-up on what you're doing. This is still work in progress. So I think that's kind of the issue: what makes a commitment credible versus cheap talk, and that's a difficult thing.
Yeah.
to measure.
But according to this analysis, if the groups are aged, if they are interested in peace talks, and if they are organized,
Right.
like having some strength, and if international involvement is such that they make this agreement stick, then this kind of commitment might be credible.
Might be credible.
Yeah.
Nabila, then Sion.
Thanks so much for being here. To address maybe the concerns of everyone else about the credible commitment problem, I wonder if the way I read the paper, I understood it as making an argument that these rebel groups make this commitment in order to establish legitimacy, less so about like actually committing, because that's kind of up in the air, but more to kind of signal to an audience, as you explained in the paper. So I wonder if you might just have a deeper discussion of that in the paper to kind of address that concern and maybe even look into the literature that exists on like political actors and legitimacy to see if any of that is useful. I don't know if it would be because it's a very slippery concept. The other thing I was curious about was if you found any like within group variation maybe over time for the word clouds on kind of as a group maybe grew bigger and stronger if they started using different vocabulary to express their intentions. And I think that would make for a stronger causal story.
Sure. And this shows that this paper is work in progress. So I when I started this paper, I thought a lot about models in game theory, costly signals, and cheap top models. But now I think it's not credible commitment problem, and it's more of a rebel group like organization and diplomatic activity that they are engaged in. So you talked about legitimacy, and I think I purposefully evaded that issue because I don't think legitimacy is core of this paper. So legitimacy, I define it as the perception, so in this context, about the rebel groups to be considered as a viable political entity that could lead the country or part of the pockets of the land that they are claiming. And here, I see a lot of motivations and incentives to gather resources, for example, so vis-a-vis in the interaction with international actors. If you're talking about anti-personnel mines issue, it's more of like getting technical assistance than really aiming at legitimacy. So I'm increasingly thinking that it might not be a commitment problem, and so credible commitment. In order to talk about credible commitment, you should really link up this activity of expression and into the words. And this paper is just about whether they are expressing themselves. So I think credible commitment question might come in once I look at the words and deeds together. But then in terms of just talking, I don't see the huge benefit of bringing in the theoretical framework of credible commitment. So that's my current thinking. It might change. And then you talked about within group variation. So we actually plotted some of the long-running rebel group, how they expressed their opinions about international law over time. And LTTE was a good example for us, that I could illustrate here about the within group variation. So they expressed human rights related words as they come towards the end. Although they killed a lot of people on the way, as you know, as they are dying. So that kind of within group variation, if I show probably in the appendix, like LTT, and maybe track down Karen's words as well. If we do that, then there will be more credible evidence to show you that there is within group variation. And actually we did some of the what's called topic models, so you are kind of letting the data speak and give me the topics that the cluster of words, bag of words that you can gather from these text data. And interestingly, they had a lot of words related to human rights as we move toward the contemporary periods more and more. So yeah, I'll probably have to include that just to satisfy reviewers more.
Okay, we've got Sian and Kelly, and So let's try to collect a couple questions and then have you respond to two or so at a time, because we're running out of getting a big queue, David and Mike's after that.
Here, and I also really enjoyed the paper, so thank you for presenting it. I had some questions about your actual text data from Geneva Call. And in particular, what seems to me, I'm not sure it's an endogeneity issue, but I'm concerned about the finding that strong groups release these statements, because it seems to me that only strong groups can release these statements. So maybe some of this conversation about within case variation would be particularly interesting to me, right? So as the LTT gains strength, do they then change their external arm?
Okay.
So when I think about some of the rebel groups that I worked on was in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of these groups don't have a political wing at all, right? So you may in fact be leaning towards a particular hypothesis just because there's only certain groups that would be able to interact on that level or have the strength to interact on that level and be interested in that. And so I was interested if you could just speak a little bit about the Geneva Call archive, because it seems to me that I don't understand how they're getting those statements. So these are statements that the rebel groups are releasing to the press. These are public documents that they're circulating. If this is just a pamphlet that like a guy is sending around his hometown, at what level does that have to be escalated to in order to end up in your text analysis?
My question is that
Let's speak up so they can hear you.
I think it's really
Thanks.
amazing to see like how this soft law encourage disengagement about these groups and like to the like international law talk. And like I'm a law student, so like when we see this kind of like documents, like we keep talking about the binding power, and I think just encouraging one itself is enough in this situation. But like when I see this word cloud, there's a like lots of nouns and adjectives, like what kind of topic they're focusing in these documents. But like when I see this kind of manipulation, we see the auxiliary verbs like should, shall, may, like that. That's like when people say shall, they show like it's kind of mandatory. You must follow this. So I was curious about like when they use this word shall with some like specific topic. So like where they express their more binding commitment to specific.
Do you want to take those two? They're pretty related, I think. You can take those two. They're pretty related.
Okay, yeah. So, I don't know whether I looked into the subtleties in the sentences. Maybe my assumption was that rebel groups, what they say is more important in terms of content, not their wording. Maybe that might be my wrong assumption. So lawyers might be seeing different things. Like if you use shall, then that might mean something more binding legal force. I was looking more into the content of the findings. So if they say that they will reduce the number of child soldiers, if they say that they will revise internal code of conduct, to political scientists, it has a bigger meaning. You do something rather than like what you say in words. So I'll have to look into that. And I don't really have good answer to that right now, but it would be interesting to see whether rebel groups do engage in like international lawyers talk. And Cien's comment about strength and the archive. So Geneva Call collected these archive. I might want to show that actually if I have time. So you can actually just sort of So you can see their search engine, and there's country, armed non-state actor. So you can see the list of rebel group names, and what we did was to extract all the documents. So if you go to FARC, for example. Oh, I mentioned the ELN, so let's do ELN from Colombia. I mean, you can. So this is the document I said. So this is like humanitarian rights, and some of the Spanish documents and French documents had to be translated first with Google Translation, and then I had students who speak French and Spanish. So, and this is the Acuerdo de Puerta del Cielo. That's the agreement I mentioned that the Catholic Church was involved. For the civil society, when they say civil society, was the Catholic Church. And when they collected these documents, I interviewed this program director, and they consulted with various international lawyers. And some of the collections within the International Committee of the Red Cross archive that they had. And they also relied on secondary sources and tried to track down bilateral agreements from international organizations and some of the unilateral statements. And like ANC was the big one that was in the press, so that was easier to track down. Some of the NGOs that were engaged in this kind of engagement activity, they volunteered these documents to the Geneva Call. So there might be a little bit of selection problem, and I'm still investigating in that issue. So you talked about the rebel group strength. So there are some rebel groups that might be weak and are left out, and if they are kind of included, and they might estimate they might bias the estimate of the rebel strength.
It does make me feel a little bit more. So I think what you're saying, and this is just a scope condition, is that this is not every party manifesto that may deal with international law. Releases like this is very clearly documents for international consumption that gets sent in some way to the international community.
Well, yeah. Some of them might be just unilateral declarations, and those documents are not directly sent to international organizations.
So that's the slippage part for me, right? So how are you sure that that one collects, so Geneva Call collects every unilateral declaration that any rebel group of any size ever makes? Because it seems to me that only the big rebel groups show up. But
so right now I have enough faith in the collection process, but have to look ways to really strengthen the credibility of the data set a bit more. So my student is looking at comparing the list again, just to see whether any weaker groups or stronger groups are left out, and maybe in future research where I'm doing some of the like Twitter and Facebook messages that might help me triangulate some of these issues a little bit more to bring in external data rather than this particular archive.
Okay, let's collect some more. David, Mike, Lee's, Barb's. So Mike first.
Well, me first? Okay. Let me focus on your dependent variable on what these groups say for international consumption. I think back to the good old days of the Cold War, when what a rebel group said very much depended on who was funding them, whether it was the West or the East. It's very simple. And if they managed to switch sides, all of a sudden they switched their rhetoric, just like that. Wasn't the problem. I realize now it's a lot more complicated, as that these rebel groups have to be a little more entrepreneurial in gathering resources from humanitarian aid, from criminal activities, from various sorts of extractive activities, including getting child soldiers, or maybe even providing services to local population, or from groups, regional powers as well as the great powers. So I guess it's a question about the data set. Are you able to, is the data able to give you a sense of how dependent different groups are on these different sources of income? Because I think that so it's the old follow the money sort of thing. What they're saying can be very dependent on what the groups are providing. I know you've got, I guess, just a dichotomous variable here for whether they're getting some support from diaspora groups or non-state actors. But does the data sets available now give you any confidence that you can differentiate among these different portfolios of support? And what difference that's going to make?
Nick? Yours been answered? Okay. Let me get mine in here, and then Barb. This is a general thing for all logistic regressions. So it's more just how you give your results out. I think it'd really be helpful to know, first of all, how many you predict correctly. You never tell us that, so we don't get a sense of that. And then also you tell us sometimes what the marginal effects are, but again, would be good to know relative to the mean, so we've got some idea. And then thirdly, just in presenting these, to see how useful the overall hypotheses are as a kind of coherent model, it's nice to see when you do make errors, do you make them equally on both sides of the diagonals? Because if the model just says yes for everything, then it's not as good of a model as if you're wrong on both sides of the diagonals equally. Those are just simple econometric things that I think would help, exposit, because the econometrics is really complementary to the other part of the narrative as I see it. Yeah, and
Sure.
Barb?
Yeah, I have a question more for related to the kind of the theoretical setup of this whole thing. Because you, as you mentioned, you did you're looking at words, not deeds. It seems to me in the front part of the paper, it's almost like you're assuming what their intentions are, when in fact, what if their intention is nothing more than to sustain themselves as a rebel group? What if it's nothing more than we just want to persist? Which could explain why they don't commit, why their deeds don't match, and therefore, as you said, it's not a matter of committing, it's just a strategy. It's like a form of PR.
Yeah.
What if it's nothing more than just a survival technique? And they're using for that purpose. So it's more like a sustainability of the group itself. And what would really even happen if they succeeded, for example, in getting a commitment internationally? Would they end their activity? I just found myself asking myself by the time you get to the conclusion, then I go back to the front end, I said, what were you really assuming why they were doing this in the first place? And so that's where there has been some prior discussion about commitments, but I'm wondering if you could be more, or consider being more explicit about the fact that maybe their goal isn't anything more than their own survival. And this is just a technique that some groups that are stronger, whatever, have available to them. And this kind of PR as a strategy for getting more members and retaining them, all this and that. Do you see what I'm saying? Maybe it's no more than that. Or maybe identifying which groups maybe of that ilk might explain some of the variance. Maybe some have no more objective than just want to persist. Just like other regimes like to persist no matter what they do to their populations, right? I'm just curious, it's just in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of how looking.
Well, Barbara, that's my current thinking. That it's actually PR exercise, and I probably have to revise the paper so that I get rid of this assumptions about actions. But then the begging question is, why do some rebel groups engage in this kind of survival technique while others don't? And I think that should be the theoretical hook that I should probably use, because it's obviously creating some confusion about like whether we should assume certain things about their ideas in looking at words, but they might be just separate things.
This is a suggestion just for that in the field of organization behavior, where they actually study behavior inside groups.
Yeah.
Sometimes it depends who the founder is.
Right.
Is this a family-driven thing? You know, what kind of movement? I'm kind of lacking
Yeah,
a lot
sure.
of
I mean,
ideas, but
leadership
sometimes
is-
actually going on the inside and understanding more about
Right.
the dynamic of the internal, how it got founded, how long has it been around, sometimes how it cannot hand itself off to the next generation. You know, maybe you have to get more inside the guts of the different groups to understand the dynamic.
Yeah,
Play to
probably I
understand better
can
why
do
one group
more
goes
in the
one way.
Myanmar case, and that kind of leadership question is kind of subsumed in the strength of command control variable. But let me just address Mike's question a little bit about outside funding, and the data can so even though they are dichotomized, they have the data. So it's not me; it's non-state actor data that was. Made by various Civil War scholars. So they have data on state funding, whether they had state external funders, whether they have non-military transnational support, not arms, but probably just money contributions. And we can see that in the results that state funding didn't really affect this kind of behavior, whereas non-military transnational support actually encouraged this kind of behavior. So that would be my short answer to your question.
Do you want any little wrap up?
And your comments, I'll certainly implement those. I mean, those
Do-
are
do-
actionable, like,
Do you know off the
comments.
top of your head how many correct you had, or just, I was just kind of curious?
I didn't count.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's not really like what political scientists usually do. Whether
But-
it's convention in
But remember,
economists.
we're an interdisciplinary group, so we care about
Yeah.
you
Yes,
reaching a
but
broader
that is
audience.
certainly
that-
doable idea.
But,
Yeah.
no, it's very,
Yeah.
it's just, you know, I'm gonna do it right.
Yeah.
Lee is saying you should do it the way the economists do.
No, so the way social scientists do it. The way social scientists do it. At an interdisciplinary forum. With that kind note. No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.